themselves. But for Nisha, that had never been an issue. She felt very proud of what she was doing, especially now that everybody was so on edge after the July 7th bombings. For people to continue, she felt like that's what she was doing. And so as Nisha finished reading the front page of the paper, she heard a bell jingle on the front door of the salon. So she tucked the newspaper away, hopped up, and went to go greet her next client. Later that night, around 10 p.m., Nisha closed up shop and swept the salon floor. And then a few minutes later, she heard the front door jingle again, and she looked up and saw her husband, whose name was Fadi Nasri, walking in with a paper bag of takeout food. Nisha instinctively shouted up the stairs for her brother, Caton, who had come home from work earlier that evening and had been hanging out in his part of the house since then. And a moment later, he came down the stairs to join the couple for some food. Fadi spread out the plastic containers of Indian food on the coffee table in the waiting area, and Caton began eating, while Fadi went ahead and sat down in Nisha's salon chair to get his haircut. And Nisha was even more careful than usual with his haircut, because she and her husband were going to their brother's wedding in a couple of days, and Nisha and Fadi knew they'd be in all the wedding pictures, and so they wanted to look their best. While she cut Fadi's hair, she helped her brother talk through preparations for the wedding. Their mother and father had both passed away years ago, so when it came to big family events like this, the two siblings were kind of on their own. Caton reminisced about how he'd given Nisha away at her own wedding, which was exactly 3 years ago yesterday, since their own father couldn't. Nisha smiled as she continued cutting Fadi's hair. Thinking about their wedding anniversary reminded her how grateful she was for her husband and the life they'd built together since. A few months after they had gotten married, Nisha had loaned Fadi some money to open up a limousine rental company, and his business had really taken off. And Nisha was proud to see her husband working these long hours and making great money. It felt like they really were a team, two ambitious, successful business owners working together to build a better future. Once Fadi's haircut was done, Nisha called Caton over and she gave him a pre-wedding trim as well. And as she finished up, Caton asked her if maybe she wanted to spend the night here at his house. He was still rattled by that attempted break-in at Nisha's house a couple of days earlier, and he really didn't feel like she was safe in her own home. But Nisha said, no, we're fine. So around 11 p.m., Nisha and her husband Fadi walked back to their house, which was, again, right around the corner. Their house was a cream-colored, two-story home with red shingles on the roof. And along with Fadi's car in the driveway, there was a stretch limo and a Humvee parked on the curb that Fadi used for work, and which both very much stood out in their middle-class neighborhood. Nisha unlocked the door and then tossed her phone and keys on the sofa and then went upstairs to get ready for bed. But while she was in the bathroom washing her face, Fadi popped his head in and told her he was heading out to go meet with his friend to go play snooker, which is a way of saying pool, but in the UK. Now, Nisha was not offended that he wanted to go out and see his friend, like that was fine. But in reality, she and her husband had been talking about wanting to start a family. And for the most part, they both agreed that now was the time to, try to have kids. And so when she was thinking about tonight, she was thinking, maybe we could, try to have a baby tonight. But it just seemed like not only tonight, but just generally speaking, every time there was like a window to, try to have a kid, Fadi was either too tired or he was going out with friends, or it just seemed like he would say he was interested, but then when it was time to actually do the thing, he was nowhere to be found. And so it seemed like that was happening again tonight. But it was late, and Nisha didn't feel like arguing with her husband, so she dried her face and just told Fadi to have fun with his friend. A few minutes later, as Nisha brushed her teeth, she heard the sound of her husband's car pulling out of the driveway. A little bit later, she went downstairs and turned off the lights and locked the doors, and then went back upstairs and crawled into bed alone. But then, about 30 minutes later, right as Nisha is about to fall asleep, she hears these footsteps in her house, and she didn't hear the sound of her husband return home. She just hears these footsteps downstairs. And so she sits up and she's hearing these sounds, and she thinks to herself, it could be my husband. Or because just less than a week ago, somebody tried to break into her house, she's thinking, are they back? Has someone broken into my house? And so not sure who was down there, she got out of bed quietly, grabbed a flashlight, tiptoed out of her room, and then began heading downstairs to see who was in her house. A few minutes later, one of Nisha's neighbors was woken up by blood-curdling screams in the street outside his house. He jumped out of bed, went to the window, pulled back the curtain, and when he looked out, he saw Nisha limping down the street in her nightgown with a flashlight in her hand. And so the neighbor instinctively called for an ambulance and then rushed outside to help Nisha. And when he caught up with Nisha, she was hobbling back up her own driveway, and he asked her if she was okay, and she just choked out that she'd been stabbed. But before she could say who stabbed her, she collapsed onto the pavement, clutching this bloody spot on her thigh. At this exact moment, the neighbor looked up from Nisha, and he saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away down the street. By this point also, more people were trickling out onto the road, and another woman ran over to Nisha and put a towel on her leg and began pressing on the wound. And then as soon as the first neighbor who had gone outside and seen Nisha, as soon as he heard the ambulance coming down the road, he stood up and he bolted down the road to go find Nisha's brother and tell him what had happened and what he had seen. Over this past winter break, when myself, my wife, and my 3 kids were home, I was sent this package of My Mochi, which is like ice cream, these little bites of premium ice cream wrapped in this sweet, chewy dough. And I was told, like, hey, try this out, see if you like it, and see if you want to advertise this product. And I'm like, all right, I obviously tried the product, and I am hooked on My Mochi. Like, seriously, I was blown away by how good these things are. I was sent strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. And let me tell you, cookies and cream is out of this world. It's so refreshing. That's the way my wife and I refer to My Mochi, as being like very refreshing. And so we plow through all this mochi we got sent, and literally we went out before this big snowstorm. We went out to the grocery store before it shut down because of the storm, just to buy all the mochi we could. Crushed it. It's so good. It's only 70 calories. It's gluten-free. It's so good, you gotta try it. My Mochi, it's the best. Each purple box comes with 6 perfectly portioned mochi snacks, available in mouth-watering flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. Cookies and cream, really quite good. Feel joyfully chill with every bite of My Mochi ice cream. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. It's really, really good. Just moments later, a few minutes before midnight, Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola felt his pager buzz. He was an experienced detective working out of the Wembley station, and that night he was the senior investigator on call in case any major crimes happened. He'd been hoping he could get through the shift without any emergencies, but when he called the station to see what that pager buzz was about, he could tell, there was clearly an emergency, because the dispatcher told him to go to 17 Sudbury Avenue as quickly as possible. And so Scola hopped in his car, and a few minutes later, he pulled up to a very chaotic scene on a residential street. In the driveway of a cream-colored house with red shingles, paramedics were loading this young woman into an ambulance, and police officers were already cordoning off the area with tape to keep a crowd of very rowdy and restless neighbors away. As Scola walked closer to this house, he saw there was a trail of blood on the driveway. He flashed his badge to the other officers standing guard around the house, and they all lifted the crime scene tape to let him come inside. One of the officers told Scola there had been a stabbing, and the victim, the young woman, was in critical condition. And while the officers were debriefing him on what they knew so far, Scola noticed a car pull up out on the street, and a man got out of the car and began running towards the house, and as he did, he was clearly crying and screaming and just basically hysterical. As he got close enough, Scola heard this man frantically tell the paramedics that he was the victim's husband. And so Scola saw this happening and just made a mental note to make sure he interviewed that guy as soon as he had any idea what he was dealing with. Scola looked around and he noticed right away that there was a stretch limousine and also a black Humvee parked in front of this house, which, obviously those are expensive. And so, maybe those attracted burglars to the house, and, maybe she was there when burglars went inside. So wrong place, wrong time. But when Scola walked up the driveway past the forensics team, who was already taking photos and collecting evidence, he noticed that the front door and the windows near the front door had no signs of forced entry. There was no damage done. And then also when Scola went around to the back of the house, the back door, the other entrance into the house, also did not show any sign of forced entry. And then when Scola went into the house, he noticed that in the living room, there was nothing broken or anything out of place, and in fact, he even saw a wallet and a stack of cash sitting out in the open, totally untouched. And so even though his initial theory was robbery, it was starting to look less and less likely. Scola left the living room and went into the kitchen. And there, he noticed there was a butcher block that was clearly missing one of its knives. And this butcher block was at the very back of the counter behind a bunch of other items, including a row of champagne glasses that did not look like they had been disturbed. So he figured that, this knife could not have been taken during a struggle, like somebody, fighting with the victim, they grab the knife and then they stab her. The knife had to have been taken when there was relative peace in the house. Otherwise, those champagne glasses and the other stuff near the butcher's block would have been toppled over, and they weren't. And so Scola began to kind of piece together a working theory of what could have happened here. And what he came up with was the victim, the young woman, must have heard a noise that spooked her. And so she wound up going into her kitchen and she carefully got her knife to protect herself and then maybe stepped outside to investigate this noise. And as soon as she got out there, her attacker or whoever was out there making the noises, maybe they were trying to break in or something, they must have seen her, they get into some sort of altercation, the knife gets pulled out of her hand, and then she is stabbed with her own knife. Now, of course, this was really specific, and Scola had no idea if this was true or not, but it would sort of explain away all the anomalies he was seeing so far. A few minutes later, Scola went outside to speak to some of the neighbors who had gathered in the street. And one neighbor told Scola that he had actually seen a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away from the scene. But this neighbor said he had not seen the man's face, so he didn't know who it was. And so at this point, Scola figured the next thing he would need to do is just speak to the victim once she was stable, because she would obviously be able to give a better description of what happened and who her attacker actually was. But unfortunately, less than an hour later, while Scola was still at the crime scene, just kind of taking it all in and asking basic questions and gathering some evidence, he got a call from the hospital. His stabbing victim, Nisha Patel Nasri, had actually bled to death on the way to the hospital, which meant this was officially a murder investigation. The next morning, after Detective Scola was finally done processing the scene, he walked into the Wembley police station, and it was unusually quiet. The other officers looked very somber. A little bit confused, Scola asked one of his colleagues what was going on here. And she would tell him that the victim, Nisha from last night's murder, was one of their own. She was a special constable, and plenty of officers in the Wembley station had worked with her. And so Scola now understood, what a gut punch this really was. But also, this information was pretty interesting to Scola, because at first, he thought Nisha was killed in like a random robbery gone wrong. But now, Scola wondered if this murder was not random at all. Maybe Nisha was being targeted because she was a police officer. Maybe there was a criminal who she had put behind bars or prosecuted in some way that was out to get her. And when Scola began doing some digging on Nisha and some of her police work, he learned that Nisha had actually had somebody try to break into her house a few days earlier. There were these 3 men that she had basically scared off when they had tried to break into her house. And so now Scola's thinking, that can't be a coincidence. And so right away, a team of officers got to work trying to figure out the identities of those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house the first time. And so while the officers did that, Scola headed back to the crime scene to go see if he could find that knife that was missing from the kitchen. He figured at this point, that had to be the murder weapon. And if it was, the killer's fingerprints or DNA could be on the knife. When Scola pulled up on Sudbury Avenue a little bit later, he saw swarms of reporters and TV cameras crowding around the house, where the crime scene tape was still up, keeping them back. And as Scola approached the house, a reporter noticed him and ran towards him with a microphone and began asking him questions. Namely, did the police have any idea why a special constable had been murdered at her own home? But Scola brushed the reporter off. He was not about to talk about this case yet. He really did not have any information to give up anyways. And he ducked under the police tape. Once inside the cordoned off area, Scola saw there were dozens of officers already scouring the area looking for this missing knife, dumping out trash cans and digging through the bushes. Scola caught one of the investigators' eyes and she kind of shrugged, which Scola took to mean that they hadn't found it yet. Scola also watched as 2 other officers hauled this high-powered vacuum out of a truck and over to a storm drain on the curb. And then they turned on this vacuum and began sucking up everything out of the drain, presumably to look for this knife. Scola walked over to them right as they began sifting through what they had sucked up. The vacuum had pulled up a whole bunch of stuff between leaves and trash and food wrappers, but ultimately there was no knife. Scola figured the killer must have dumped this knife somewhere near the crime scene, because they couldn't have gotten far before they realized they needed to get rid of it. And so Scola felt confident that this knife was going to turn up eventually. They just had to keep on looking. In the meantime, Scola went back inside the house, where he found a pair of investigators sitting in the living room with Nisha's husband, Fadi. And Fadi had his phone out, and he was playing a recording of this woman shouting violent threats. One of the officers who saw Scola pulled him aside and caught him up to speed. They said that Fadi had a solid alibi for the time of Nisha's murder. He was with a friend playing snooker a few miles away, and that friend had already confirmed it. And the officer also told Scola that Fadi had come forward and said that he already had a pretty good idea of who might have killed his wife. And so Scola sat down on the couch next to Fadi, and Fadi at that point started his story from the beginning. He said that 2 months ago, he'd gotten into a feud with a rival limo business owner in Scotland. He said that he had sold a Humvee to this other company under the condition that after the sale, Fadi could borrow it back for one last job. But the other company's owner had gone back on the deal and refused to let him borrow the car after the transaction. So in a moment of what he was calling poor judgment, Fadi had traveled to Scotland, rented the Humvee under a fake name, and driven it all the way back to London. But then Fadi said, while he was driving back to London, clearly the other owner figured out what Fadi was up to, because they gave Fadi a call, and Fadi recorded the voicemail they left. And so Fadi played the recording of this other business owner for Scola. And Scola, he heard this woman screaming over and over again that she was going to kill Fadi and his wife if he didn't bring her Humvee back. And as Scola listened, he thought this woman did not sound like she was joking. This seemed like a real threat. Now, Fadi said he did return the Humvee. He gave it back to the business owner, and so she no longer had a reason to kill him and his wife. Still though, Fadi felt strongly that, this woman really had it out for them, and so he wanted the police to look into her. And for Scola, they really didn't have that many leads to think of, and so he figured he would check it out first. So he took Fadi's phone to download that audio recording and also all the call logs, and then he promised he would send a team to Scotland to look into this right away. One afternoon, about a month later, Detective Scola sat in his office alone, going over the case files again and again. He was stressed because the media had been covering Nisha's murder since day one, and there was a lot of public pressure to solve this case. But the police had been investigating it really aggressively for a month, but realistically had almost nothing to show for it. Ever since Scola's last conversation with Fadi, the investigation had been moving very slowly. Some detectives had gone to Scotland to look into this rival business owner angle who had, supposedly threatened Fadi and his wife, but they hadn't found anything notable. So that lead was looking like a bust. Also, the homicide team had not been able to identify those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house 5 days before she was killed. Scola and his team had interviewed Nisha's family, her friends, her neighbors, but so far they had not been able to identify any likely suspects, again outside of that business owner in Scotland. It just didn't seem like there was anyone who would have wanted to hurt Nisha. She was liked and respected by basically everyone they spoke to. However, there had been one pretty significant development in the case over the past month, and it was that police had finally found a knife that looked similar to the one missing from Nisha's kitchen. It was found in a storm drain about a block away from her house. However, Scola was still waiting for the crime lab to actually determine whether it was the murder weapon or not. But just then, Scola got a phone call, and it was someone from the crime lab. And they told him that after analyzing this knife, they had found traces of Nisha's blood on the blade. So this definitely was the murder weapon. For the first time in weeks, Scola felt really optimistic. He finally had a real piece of hard evidence, a fresh clue here to really lead this investigation. And now he needed all hands on deck. So he hung up the phone and then gathered his team for a meeting. And then once they were all together, he told the other detectives that they had found the murder weapon. But they had to keep their discovery a secret. If the killer found out police had this knife, they might panic and flee. And so to avoid jeopardizing the investigation, Scola wanted to keep the discovery out of the press. After everybody was aligned on that, the next step in the investigation was that Scola was going to send officers out to collect video from all the security cameras near where the knife had been found. London is one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the entire world, with hundreds of thousands of CCTV cameras everywhere. So Scola figured one of those cameras must have captured the person who dropped that knife into the drain. The homicide squad would spend the rest of the week combing through countless hours of CCTV footage from the area, hoping to find the moment when the knife got dropped in the storm drain. But it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. However, after about a week of this, another detective eagerly called Scola over to his computer. He said he had finally found something that could be useful. And so Scola walked over, and the detective said that the footage he was looking at, which was paused at the moment, was of a CCTV camera taken from a shop that was on the same road as the storm drain. And so Scola bent down and stared at the screen as the detective hit play on the video. Now, the storm drain itself was just barely out of frame, but the camera clearly captured the glow of headlights as a car pulled up near the storm drain. The car stopped there for about 7 seconds, and even though you cannot see anybody getting out and disposing of a knife into the drain, the car was stopped long enough that somebody could have done that before the car took off again. But critically, when this car took off again, it passed through this camera's frame very clearly. And as the car drove past the storefront, the detective paused the camera. As soon as he did, Scola leaned in closer to get a better look at this car. Now, the video was dark and grainy, so right away it was impossible to read the license plate on the car. But despite the graininess, there definitely were a few identifying details Scola could make out. The car was clearly a gray Audi, and there was an antenna in the center of the roof, and also one of the lights above the license plate was not working. Now, Scola knew there were literally tens of thousands of Audis in London, and so they knew the only way they'd track this one down is by sending officers out into the street to literally look for it. But really what they're looking for is Audis that have that antenna on the roof and a light that doesn't work in front. Now, of course, this was going to be extremely time-consuming, but Scola felt like they didn't have a better lead here, and so they began this process. And for the next few weeks, that's all they were doing, just out on the streets canvassing for this Audi, and they didn't find it. And so as this investigation was feeling like it was about to hit another dead end, Scola felt like he just couldn't let that happen. There was too much pressure on him to get this done. But then suddenly, he thought about something that he'd totally put out of his mind: Fadi's phone. They'd actually taken the phone from Fadi 2 months ago to download that voicemail and also download the call log, but they actually hadn't given it back to Fadi yet. They were just holding the phone in evidence right now. Now, Scola felt like that audio message on the phone really had not amounted to anything and likely wouldn't. But Scola figured, why don't we look in that phone to see what else is on there? Maybe there were fresh clues about who might have wanted to hurt Nisha. So he assigned one of his forensic techs to download everything from Fadi's phone onto a drive. And then once they had done that, Scola took this drive and he plugged it into his computer and began sorting through all this data. He saw a photo that caught his eye. The photo was of a woman's thigh, and she was clearly lying in a bed in what looked like a hotel room. And even with the bright flash and poor camera quality, Scola could tell that the woman's skin was pale white, and so it was definitely not Nisha's leg. After finding this photo on Fadi's phone, Scola immediately drove to Nisha and Fadi's house. And when Fadi opened the door, Scola stepped inside and showed him the photo and asked him point blank if he was having an affair. Fadi right away said no, and he insisted he would never do that to Nisha, and the woman in the picture was literally just a friend. Now, Scola immediately felt like Fadi was lying. He did not believe him for a second. But there was no way to, force Fadi to tell the truth. So ultimately, all Scola could do was just leave, get back in his car, go back to the station. And on the drive there, he wondered to himself if he had sort of just blown that opportunity. Should he have waited for more solid evidence before confronting Fadi? But he was also thinking that, there's so much pressure on him to solve this case, that he just had to make moves like this, take some chances. And so it is what it is. When Scola got to the precinct, he parked his car and he went in his office to think. And almost as soon as he sat down, there was a knock at the door. It was a man named Sid Shinoy, who was the family liaison officer who'd been working with Nisha's family. His job was to support the grieving family and communicate with them throughout the investigation. And so as a result of this role he was playing, Sid had created a level of trust with the family that really none of the other detectives had with the family. And Shinoy, when he walked in the room, told Scola that he'd just gotten a really interesting call from Fadi. He said Fadi had confessed to something that he'd basically been too afraid to tell Scola in person when he had just been visiting him, a couple minutes ago. And so Shinoy told Scola that you really ought to call Fadi and let him tell you what he just told me. And so right away, that's what Scola did. He called Fadi. And Fadi, when he picked up, he sounded very nervous and anxious and ashamed as he broke down and admitted that actually, yes, he was having an affair. He had lied. He said the leg in the photo belonged to a woman named Laura Mocking, and she was a Lithuanian sex worker who he'd been seeing for 3 months before his wife's death. Fadi said the reason he had lied to Scola is because he didn't want Nisha's family to find out he'd been cheating on her. But Scola knew there was also another obvious reason to lie here, because an affair would clearly give Fadi a motive to kill his wife. Fadi had been crossed off the suspect list at this point just based on his alibi. But this affair now made him look very suspicious. However, Scola just felt like it just didn't make sense that Fadi would be the killer. Number one, he did have a strong alibi. And also, two, apart from hiding this affair, which you could justify, you could say that obviously he didn't want ripple effect damage on the family or something. He'd been very cooperative with the investigation. I mean, he'd given them his phone, which had this damning photo on it. I mean, he'd sort of been very forthright. And so a new theory began to take hold in Scola's mind. If Fadi wasn't the killer, maybe it was possible that his mistress, Laura, was, or at least was directly involved in some way. I mean, she would have all the reason in the world to want to get rid of Nisha. So on September 1st, almost 4 months after Nisha was murdered, her husband's mistress, Laura Mocking, was brought into the station on suspicion of murder. In the interrogation room, detectives confronted her with all the evidence they had gathered that showed her relationship with Fadi was not just a casual affair. The two of them had met at a brothel where Laura was working as a sex worker, but eventually she stopped charging him to see her, which likely meant she must have developed real feelings for him. And so the detectives suggested that, if Nisha was gone for good, Laura would have Fadi all to herself. Laura insisted she did not know anything about the murder, and then she gave them a solid alibi. But that didn't mean much, because eyewitnesses thought they saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away after Nisha was stabbed. So the working theory was if Laura was involved in this murder, it was pretty likely that she had hired somebody else to do the dirty work. However, the detectives did not have real evidence, and so despite their suspicions, they had to release her. And then once again, they were back at square one.
Can I suck you? Yort. Yort. Oh, wow. Why do you guys have more health than you would expect?
However, not long after Laura was allowed to go home, Scola was walking through the precinct when the family liaison officer, Sid Shinoy, came running up behind him. Shinoy told him that he just had a very interesting conversation with Nisha's brother, Caton. Caton had told him that after finding out about Fadi's affair, he had been furious. The whole family was so upset about it. And Caton said that now that he really had this horrible opinion of Fadi, he felt comfortable sharing something about Fadi that he had been keeping to himself. Caton told Shinoy that he thought Fadi might not be the professional businessman he pretended to be. Instead, Caton said that Fadi might actually be involved with something criminal. According to Caton, Fadi had said there were a lot of sketchy people in his contacts, and he was worried about what the police might find on his phone. But Caton said that Fadi had not been specific about what he meant when he said sketchy people. He didn't know what he was saying or why he was involved with them. And so after hearing this, Scola told his team to go through Fadi's phone records and run the name of every person who appeared in his call log. And apart from all the calls back and forth to Laura, the mistress, there was one other name that jumped out, a convicted drug dealer named Roger Leslie. And when Scola saw this, he realized that he might have been approaching this investigation all wrong. He'd really struggled to find suspects because there was no one who would have wanted to hurt Nisha who didn't have an alibi. But now he realized that maybe that was the case because Nisha was not actually the killer's target. Maybe the target was Fadi. If Fadi was involved in the drug trade, then anyone could have come after him for any number of reasons. It could have been a drug deal gone wrong, or retribution for a debt he didn't pay, or even maybe a hit by a rival gang. He didn't know, but there was way more possibilities here. And the more Scola dug into Fadi, the more suspicious evidence he found.
Ooh.
He learned that before
Hello,
Fadi and
Governor.
Nisha got married, Fadi had run an escort agency.
Oh, it's the grave
He
guy.
closed it down and
Yay.
started a more legitimate
Potentially a new
business
thing
3
of
years
zombie.
ago, but Scola knew
Please,
there could be
trustworthy.
any
Then I can
number
just
of
look like a
former
zombie.
employees or customers or
Yeah, I know how to do it.
customers' wives
What's this
who
one?
might still have a problem with Fadi. And then there was that
That's
threatening
the
voicemail
pop
from the
one,
rival limo company. I mean, that whole story
got
made
to
it
do?
seem entirely possible that
Mine.
Fadi could easily get wrapped up in very serious business disputes, which meant there could be more disgruntled rivals out there. Basically,
be the
it
one.
seemed entirely possible that there were loads of people out there
Okay.
who might have had
This
it out
one.
for Fadi, not Nisha. And so that became the new direction of this investigation. And so the first person Scola looked into with this new direction was Roger Leslie, the drug dealer who had made a few calls to Fadi.
Okay.
However, there was one
yeah,
issue that kept
this
Roger
one.
from becoming a primary suspect.
Hello,
He
Governor.
didn't own a gray Audi. So if he was involved in the murder,
yeah.
he probably didn't work alone. And so the police set up a trace on Roger Leslie's phone, hoping that his call logs would lead them to an associate who did own a gray Audi. And eventually, they sure did. And that person who owned the gray Audi was the missing piece that made the whole puzzle come together.
What's this one? Pots. That's actually funny because now I can just do that.
Based on those call logs and all the other evidence
that mean
found
that
during
this
this
one's been the
investigation,
same one this entire
following is
time?
what police believe happened to Nisha Patel Nasri on May
I know it
11th,
happened.
2006.
Check. Yup, that's fucking funny. Use.
Around 11:50 p.m., just as
shit,
Nisha was
funny,
falling
boy.
asleep, the killer pulled up to her house in the passenger seat of a gray Audi. The driver waited in the car while the killer got out and crept around to the back of the house.
Have God.
And as he
have
walked to the
God,
back of the
forgive
house,
me.
he kept looking in the windows to confirm all the
Oh, I
lights
got
were
the email.
out. And they were.
Yeah,
And then when he got
that's
to the
fine, I
back
guess.
door, he pulled out a key he'd managed to get his hands on to open it up. And then once the door was open, he stepped inside. The killer slowly moved through the kitchen and then stopped because he heard the floorboards upstairs creaking. And so he held his breath as he realized that somebody upstairs was making their way downstairs. They were caught. The killer didn't know what to do. They hadn't prepared for this at all. He thought everybody in the house would be asleep. So he panicked and he reached over and pulled a knife out of that butcher's block in the kitchen and then ducked behind a wall to hide. He heard the footsteps getting closer and closer, and he's trying his best to hide. And then he saw a beam of a flashlight make its way into the kitchen, and then it comes across and lands squarely right on them. And the person holding that flashlight was Fadi's wife, Nisha. When Nisha saw the killer, she screamed and ran for the front door. But the killer knew he could not let her get away because now she'd gotten a clear look at his face and he was caught. So he chased her outside, out into the driveway, clutching that kitchen knife in his hand. And about halfway down the driveway, he tackled her and then sunk the knife deep into her thigh. Nisha actually managed to fight him off despite this gaping wound in her leg, and she scrambled up and began running down the street screaming for help. And at this point, the killer saw lights coming on in the neighbors' houses, and his heart was pounding, and he knew that Nisha was no longer his biggest problem. He had to get out of here immediately before anybody on the block saw his face too. So he just sprinted back to the Audi where the driver was still waiting for him, and he told the driver to go, just take off, drive out of here. And so the driver, they did just that, but they were panicked and confused, and as they're going around the corner, they're asking the killer, like, what just happened? I mean, as far as the driver knew, they were only here to pick up some ecstasy for a drug deal. They did not expect anybody to get stabbed. But the killer just snapped at the driver to stop talking about it because he hadn't expected the night to go this way either. It was a total mess. And so at this point, the killer looked down at the bloody knife that was still in his hand, and he realized he had to get rid of it. And so he told the driver to just pull over. And so the driver did. They pulled over to the curb on this commercial street just a block away from Nisha's house. And the killer quickly opened up the door and threw the knife into a nearby storm drain. Then he and as the Audi careened down the road, the killer took the driver's cell phone out of the cup holder and called the man who'd hired him to tell him everything that had just gone horribly wrong. The person he called was the drug dealer, Roger Leslie. However, when Roger got off that phone call with the killer, Roger immediately called the person who'd hired him. Roger had actually been hired to pull off a hit, but he didn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he'd outsourced the job. But now, after having spoken to the killer about this botched hit where basically they stabbed her and they had no idea if she actually was going to die or not, in fact, the last thing they saw was her running down the road screaming for help, now Roger knew he would have to explain himself to the actual mastermind of the murder plot, the person who'd given him the key to get inside. And that person was indeed Fadi Nasri, Nisha's husband. It turned out that Fadi was involved with a bunch of criminals. They weren't after him, they were his friends. Because even though Fadi pretended to be this successful, legitimate businessman, he really was not. He was deep in debt, and he'd paid Roger Leslie to kill Nisha for the life insurance money. That way he could pay his debts and then also run off with his new mistress, Laura. And so while Nisha had been wanting to start a family and was starting to sense that maybe Fadi was not fully committed to that idea, well, her instincts were good because it turned out Fadi did not want to start a family with her. He wanted to kill her and move on. According to prosecutors, that earlier break-in at Nisha and Fadi's house a few days before she was killed was very likely either a reconnaissance mission or a failed first attempt to kill Nisha. In the end, 4 people were arrested and charged with Nisha's murder. They were Fadi Nasri, Roger Leslie, the hitman who actually stabbed Nisha, his name was Jason Jones, and the driver of the car, a man named Tony Emanuel. Now, the driver was acquitted, but the other 3 men were all convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
Okay.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Can I buy this on? Ah.
Just over a decade ago, Kanye West and Adidas released the Yeezy Boost 350 Turtle Dove, a shoe which, in my opinion, symbolized one of the craziest cultural moments ever. The hype beast era. Brands like Supreme and Nike were causing riots. Kids in school were showing up in fake Yeezys getting roasted, and people were dressing like this, or even this. But what tied all of these crazy streetwear pieces together was the shoes. I mean, you weren't gonna pop out in off-white Supreme and have Nike Huaraches on. That would have been crazy in 2016. Sneakers were at the core of the hypebeast streetwear fashion trend. I mean, literally every single influencer, celebrity, and YouTuber I followed at that time was wearing Yeezys or Human Races or Jordans or Nike Dunks or some dope-ass shoe. And if you were super into shoes, you were dubbed a sneakerhead. The 2010s were the perfect time to be a sneakerhead, with the community and culture being at its peak. But nowadays, it's like no one cares anymore. No one's rioting outside of pop-up shops, there's no crazy hype for a new sneaker release, and craziest of all, a lot of these super hype shoes that sold for thousands lost all of their value. So what happened to the sneakerheads, the sneaker economy, and the entirety of the hypebeast era? Well, I think that there are 4 main reasons all of this died, with the first reason being thanks to sneaker resellers. Collecting sneakers and sneakerhead culture has been around for a long time, and it roughly began in the 70s. But things really started going crazy once Jordans were introduced in the 80s. Air Jordans were produced by Nike, inspired by basketball star Michael Jordan, and the first shoe they released was the iconic Jordan 1. Of course, around this time, other shoes were sought after too, like Converses and other brands that I'm forgetting right now. But let's be real here, Jordans were the cream of the crop. According to National Geographic, for some weird reason, they said sneaker culture began to take off beyond the basketball court too. When the influential hip-hop group Run DMC released their single My Adidas in 1986, it earned the group a first-of-its-kind endorsement deal with the brand. Soon after, Kurt Cobain of the grunge band Nirvana made Converse a symbol of rebellion and youth. Sneakers were popularized popularized and glamorized by celebrities, especially athletes and musicians, who set the trends and influenced the culture. This generated excitement for sneakers. People coveted certain shoes that the youth deemed cool, and kids started collecting them. The companies realized this, so companies like Nike, Adidas, and more began releasing limited edition sneakers.
Kids were camping out in front of shoe stores, much like this episode of HBO's Entourage.
I don't get it. All these people are online for sneakers? Oh, yeah. Some of them probably even camped out all night for sneakers. Vince, these ain't just sneakers. These are limited edition Fukijamas.
Fuki whatas?
In some cities, they were breaking down doors, rioting. Some were even arrested.
If someone gets hurt in front of a Nike store, you're gonna blame Nike. You can't get hurt clicking a button.
The reason they would do this is to drive up demand and the forbidden H word, hype. If 200 people wanted the shoe and they only sold 100, resellers in the aftermarket could mark up those shoes. Maybe 100 of those 200 people couldn't quite afford the new price, but the other 100 could. And this is where the problem began. For a long time, resellers, or their less pleasant name, scalpers, weren't the worst thing in the sneaker community, and they weren't as hated as they are today. If anything, them marking up shoes an extra chunk of change made the sneaker community more intense. It made waiting in line for a brand new pair of shoes all the more thrilling, and it helped to inflate the artificial value of these shoes since they were even more expensive than the retail price. But for the most part, sneakerheads and everyone in the community, even the resellers, were pretty into shoes. Buy, sell, trade was the motto for a lot of these people, collecting and trading sneakers like they were Pokemon cards. And honestly, it was a pretty cool community until it got infiltrated. It's kind of hard to put a timestamp on this, but I'd say roughly the early 2010s is when the sneaker community started to get really hot, especially thanks to social media and pop culture. It was in this time period that sneaker brands like Jordan, Nike, and others were picking up even more steam. Simultaneously, streetwear brands and streetwear fashion was taking off, with Supreme, Bape, Off-White, and more picking up steam. Or Palace, do you guys remember Palace? That was fire. Any and everyone was jumping onto the streetwear and sneaker hype train. Again, according to Nat Geo, the Kardashian era had a huge impact on the culture. It helped target a whole new demographic of people to experience sneaker culture. It was a blending of high and low fashion, which the shoe industry has never really seen before. Because of all of these people getting involved, the forbidden H word I mentioned was getting bigger, and everyone was becoming a hype beast. The term hype beast had actually been around since the mid-2000s, and originally it was a derogatory term for people who just followed streetwear trends. But eventually, it was embraced by these sorts of people who were proud to be hype beasts.
Tell me the difference between the kids today versus what you were doing 35 years ago.
These kids today don't seem like they want the shoes, they want the thing that goes along with having the shoes. Somebody figured out that there's money for a pair of sneakers because of this hype.
The hype is generated by Nike, which denied Nightline's request to talk about its strategy. For prize sneakers, they make a limited supply, driving up the aftermarket price tag.
Another good example of the hypebeast trend can be seen in Supreme. While not quite sneakers, Supreme was directly related to sneaker culture. The brand was popularized by Tyler the Creator, Odd Future, and skate culture. It became so trendy and so hyped that people were out there buying Supreme bricks and Supreme shovels, and then reselling them for hundreds of dollars and sometimes thousands.
Kid, they wait in line for 3 or 4 days now.
For what?
You're probably gonna freak out when I show you what they're waiting for.
Please do.
Get shovels, bricks.
Shovels and bricks.
We can only thank Supreme for making this. Their new shovel.
This is around the time when everybody and their mom was getting into streetwear or sneaker culture, all for the sake of the hype. Every celebrity was making their own shoe. You had Kanye with Yeezys, never mind the Red Octobers that he already made that were super hype, super rare, and dope. You had Pharrell with the Human Races, one of my personal favorites from the hype era. You had Travis Scott with the Travi Patty 4s and the Cactus Jackie Dunks. I don't know what the Dunks are called, I made that up. And the 4s too, they're not called the Travi Patties. And low-key, one of the most slept-on sneakers, the OVO 12s by Drake and Jordan. I don't think it was really slept on at the time, but these were smooth. And retrospectively, this was a crazy time to be alive. Not only were massive celebrities collaborating with sneaker brands, streetwear brands like Supreme dropped an insane collab with Louis Vuitton, which brought the hypebeast era in streetwear to a whole new level. Need I even mention all of the sneakers that Off-White put out with Nike and Converse? Seriously, it was ridiculous how many collabs they had. It was an entire takeover of the pop culture. I mean, these collabs between all of these big names and brands resulted in hype never seen before. it was off the charts.
Oh.
SoundCloud Rap 2 was popping off at the time, and everyone in it was wearing hypebeast stuff. And on top of all this, all of your favorite influencers and internet people were dripped out in hypebeast stuff too. I mean, remember when FaZe Banks and RiceGum tried to make that fashion brand? And at the time, I was watching a lot of Nadeshot because he was one of my favorite COD players. And next thing I know, he's doing this hypebeast sneaker collection videos on his channel. On top of this, Complex had that sneaker shopping series that I guess they still have, but back then they had people like Eminem, Ronaldo, Migos, literally everybody was on it. It felt like in every single facet of pop culture, sneaker culture, streetwear culture, and hype beast stuff was everywhere. I mean, dude, there was this YouTuber who was huge back then called Blazendary, whose biggest video is wearing a crazy outfit on my first day of school. In parentheses, Supreme, Louis Vuitton, Gucci.
Today I decided to bust out a $4,000 outfit for school just to see if I can get some reactions out of my friends and maybe even a teacher or two. We'll have to see. As you guys can see, I'm wearing the Supreme Louis Vuitton box logo along with 3 gold chains, a Louis Vuitton belt with Supreme boxers, and the Gucci snakes that I picked up for my birthday vlog. And you guys are gonna be surprised for the kind of backpack I use for school. All I use is just a regular old Supreme Courier backpack.
And this got 14 million views. This entire time, the aftermarket was growing in accordance to the hype. As many of you may or may not remember, shoes and clothes from these brands in particular began to get very expensive. In 2013, Grailed was created, and in 2015, StockX and GOAT were created as well. There were others, but these were some of the main websites to buy and sell your stuff on, and everyone wanted to start reselling, myself included. I was about 14 years old, I think, when this stuff started popping off, and I took notice. And like any 14-year-old at the time, I was infatuated with sneaker culture. I thought it was so cool. All my friends were getting cool shoes. I didn't have any money, so my brain immediately went to, I need to start flipping shoes like everyone else on the internet. So I bought my first pair of expensive sneakers ever when the Yeezy Zebras dropped, and I sold them for $300 profit on Twitter. I'll probably throw some pictures up on screen for you guys, but you know what? My business went pretty well. I think I did all right. Now, I'm not very proud of being a reseller, or more realistically a scalper, but I was also a kid, so don't tear my head off. I only did it with like 15 pairs of shoes. I wasn't and I didn't have a lot of money back then, but I did do this for a little on a small scale, buying and selling various shoes and reselling them on my buy sell trade Instagram page or my Twitter. Actually, I think the Twitter I use right now is what I started it for sneakers. However, I think my experience as a reseller is important for this video because it kind of shows how things went south in sneaker culture. I was doing it at such a small scale, buying only a pair or two of sneakers every time there was a hype drop. And I joined the community at the end of it though, because the already experienced resellers who were older and had much more capital were about to take over. Yeezys by Kanye West and Adidas were undoubtedly the most hype shoe you could buy at the time. The 350 V1s were like diamonds, very rare and very expensive, and the V2s were like gold. And people were rushing to buy the new V2s every time they dropped like it was a modern day gold rush. Quickly, people began to create bot programs and bots to buy shoes on releases quicker than any human with 10 computers could, because back then you had to wait in a queue. So what I would do is I'd set up my computer, I'd set up my laptop, I'd grab everyone in my house's phone, and I'd pull up the Yeezy website on every device, multiple tabs, and wait and hope I got in on one tab. But when the bots came, there was nothing you could do. If you didn't have bots, you were pretty much out of luck. Not only that, but some people were buying up all the supply of all the shoes in the aftermarket, paying the premiums, and then just controlling the price because they had so much capital to begin with. I remember going to the bathroom every Thursday at school at like 10 a.m. trying to catch the Supreme drop just for it to be sold out in 5 seconds. Like, it was impossible to compete with bots.
I feel like that was part of the culture, right? Like for me, that was just part
like
of the experience.
Physical outside.
The physical outside, waiting in the cold on December 23rd when the Space Jams came out,
Jordan 11s, yeah.
I lined up 14 hours in like -2-degree weather.
Did you get the shoe?
I did. Then when it transitions everything online and I couldn't get anything unless you had a bot.
Bots, yeah.
I didn't have the bots. People were investing thousands of dollars on bots. It kind of like pushed people like me out of the community because I wasn't doing it for a resale. I wasn't doing it to sell my sneakers. I was doing it because I wanted the sneaker. I wanted to wear them. I wanted to show them off when around my friends.
Resellers who previously were casually buying sneakers and selling them time to time for fun or for the occasional profit were now operating and treating sneakers as a full-time business. This is at a time when I remember everyone on Twitter was a guru or a hustler, flexing how much they made and telling you can pay them to learn the ways. This is also around the time that dropshipping gurus started popping up, like the Ty Lopez era. And I remember people on Twitter were even selling these things called jigs, where you could get stuff for free basically. Regardless, the whole community, especially people my age in high school, started to resell shoes. And it began to get so competitive that it was one of the main things that ruined sneaker culture. Resellers went too far. Everyone was trying to do it, even myself. Again, I don't think I was a big part of the problem though. I only sold like 15 pairs of shoes when I was a kid, but hey, it wasn't the best thing I've ever done. Resellers had always been a part of sneaker culture, and I don't think there was really a problem with them for the first few decades, as the market seemed more organic. But as sneaker popularity was astroturfed in the hype era, many people, including young, dumb, impressionable kids like 14-year-old me, saw it as an opportunity to make money and be just like their favorite celebrity, artist, or influencer who was flexing, balling out, wearing all this dope-ass streetwear. It got to a point where all of the interest was artificially inflated, to the point where the market was mostly just resellers buying and trading to resell, not even selling to people anymore. I think a good example of how scummy resellers began to get is when they tried to take advantage of Kobe's death. According to an article on ESPN, in January of 2020, Nike had to quickly remove all of its Kobe Bryant related products from the shelves to stop people from profiting off of his death. And they weren't even able to do it successfully because sneakers and memorabilia prices were hiked by 200 to 300% on resale sites within 24 hours of his passing. Thanks to resellers, the middle class of the sneaker economy could no longer afford to buy the shoes. And for the most part, it was either big resellers trading with one another or selling to celebrities or selling to rich people who could afford it. But then the bubble burst.
Does anyone want to explain why shoes are literally just dying right now? I own a sneaker store and we've been struggling for the last couple months. And y'all can say, oh, it's because you overprice things. And I know what you're gonna say. Oh, it's a Yeezy. You're overpricing it. It's $110. Retails like 2 something. Market's like 190. I'm pricing it at 110. It's brand new. An off-white lot dunk, which you haven't been able to get for 4 years now. Used to be going for $500 to $600. Market's like $400. We have them priced at $320.
I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I made a decent amount of money reselling sneakers, but I got so many pairs that never sold. And some of these inventory hasn't just been sitting for 6 months, a year, 2 years. Some of these inventories been sitting for 3+ years. And at this point, I don't even know what to do. Like this dunk right here, the ones that you guys are seeing right now, I had them for over 561 days. Like guys, how is that even possible? Like,
at first, sneaker reselling caused the death of sneaker culture. The resellers made shoes unattainable for the everyday sneakerhead. However, as we saw in those clips and the intro, prices for a lot of these shoes have dropped drastically. Resellers are going broke. So why are prices dropping so hard, and why are people no longer interested in sneaker culture or hype culture like they used to be? Well, a big reason was because there ended up being too much supply. And this is also thanks to the resellers. They just ruined all of it, didn't they? Sneaker companies wanted to fight back against resellers, and to do this, they flooded the market, which made it nearly impossible for shoes to be hoarded. Nike was one of the major players in this. To combat resellers, especially with the Panda Dunks and Jordan 1s, Nike drastically increased volume on these popular models, leading to market oversaturation and a significant drop in resale prices.
Is there one dunk that is still selling heavy from years past?
Nope.
Really?
Are Panda Dunks still selling? Can you still Panda
really?
Dunks are dead? Panda Dunks are officially dead.
I got offered wholesale for $50. Nobody's buying them. You can't even sell them at retail.
Nike moved away from the extreme scarcity model to maximize direct-to-consumer sales, which undermined the get-rich-quick model for resellers. On top of this, the pace at which drops came to the market became completely unsustainable. Beforehand, more exclusive drops drove demand through the roof, but over time they ended up releasing new sneakers almost every single week, whether it be a new colorway, a new model, a slightly different colorway change, a re-release of an old colorway. They were just spam releasing shoes, making the sneaker market as a whole feel irrelevant, since no one needs or even wants that much stuff. And this struggle to find a happy balance between supply and demand isn't new either. This is going back decades, with the early 2000s market looking completely different from how it did at its peak. Early on, size runs were low, often obnoxiously to the point where everyone spent most of their time on forums complaining about the impossibility of finding a decent pair. A run of 24 to 36 pairs was not uncommon, but 500 to 1,000 was more likely. This period was all about creating something cool to stimulate the growing global community of footwear obsessives. In response to all the complaining, Nike, amongst other brands, produced more, a lot more. So what they originally sold as exclusive became extremely and maybe too accessible. And I believe that to a degree, rarity and exclusivity is nice. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't want to walk outside and see everyone wearing the exact same pair of shoes that I'm wearing. It got to a point where Jordan 1s were about as accessible as Nike Roches. You guys remember those? Those were like, that's crazy. But this didn't just happen with Nike. Kanye's Yeezy brand famously partnered with Adidas in 2014, and as I explained, they absolutely blew up. But then Kanye started his whole Twitter rant and anti-Semitism stuff, which is obviously not a good look for Adidas, no matter how well the shoes were selling. I remember he even said, "Adidas won't cancel my contract," and then they did, which was kind of funny. As a result, came a pretty hefty and publicized feud over how things were going to work out in the split, and after a long legal battle following the cut ties in 2022, an agreement was finally reached. Adidas chief executive Bjorn Gulden told reporters, without giving any details of the agreement away, that there aren't any more open issues and there is no money going either way. Ending the partnership in 2022 left Adidas with unwanted Yeezy stock worth some 1.2 billion pounds, including shoes and other goods. To combat this inventory problem, Adidas planned to sell off all the remaining inventory by the end of 2024. Since Yeezys were pretty much the thing in the sneakerhead and hypebeast game, a huge influx of new and cheap product wrecked the exclusive market. Plus, they re-released tons of old Yeezy models that sneakerheads thought could never be re-released, diluting the previously successful market. Adidas and Yeezy were already kind of doing what Nike was doing before Kanye ruined his relationship with Adidas, but once they decided to sell off the stock, it was GG's, completely disorienting the current supply and demand structure. So after resellers priced everyone out, the pendulum swung right back, and so many sneakers released it overwhelmed everyone to the point where they didn't care. The companies themselves weren't so innocent in all of this either. StockX, one of the biggest platforms for reselling, was actually sued by Nike for various reasons, including the fact that they were selling counterfeit shoes. This had always been a big controversy with StockX, and if you're in the sneaker community, you would know that tons of people would record videos trying to get fake shoes through their verification system, which is what they were known for, and StockX actually lost the lawsuit. But Nike and its associates aren't perfect either. Nike executive Ann Hebert or whatever left the company after her son allegedly used corporate issued credit cards to buy $132,000 worth of shoes. Apparently he only made like 20k profit, which is crazy. But as I'm sure many of you can imagine, a lot of people assume that she was the one helping him backdoor the shoes so that they could skim some money off the top, and then if she ever got caught, she could blame it on her son. She then became the CEO of Foot Locker, with Redditors commenting things like, "Smart, why limit yourself to backdooring just one brand?" But there were also two other reasons that sneaker culture died. One of which is that fashion simply moved on. I mean, can you picture someone wearing something like this these days? Along with the financial side and exclusivity pressure placed on hypebeast fashion, the trends just moved on to something else like they always do, which Off-White's creator, the late and great Virgil, predicted before his death, saying in an interview, "I would definitely say it's gonna die, you know? Like, its time will be up." Overall, as a broad vein of fashion, streetwear has lost its definition. As RB Lee, the vice president for content strategy at Hypebeast, said, "I can't even define it anymore." It's not that people have grown tired of streetwear's building blocks, it's that those hoodies and sneakers and t-shirts have become so absorbed by high fashion that the line between streetwear and fashion has pretty much disappeared. It has simply become the platform on which the whole system stands, said Demna, the creative director at Balenciaga. A big point of the lifestyle shoes and the streetwear fashion was to be like anti-establishment, but when everyone started wearing it, it's kind of like that is establishment now, especially when high fashion started collaborating with streetwear brands. Vogue Business also reported that sneaker demand has practically nosedived. Tons of people started opting towards higher fashion focused show choices, like with the current trend of boots. Many have even pointed to the nail in the sneakerhead coffin being when Trump announced his own pair of sneakers on the campaign trail.
Trump's first stop at a sneaker convention in Philadelphia, facing some boos from the audience.
It's a slightly different audience than I'm used to, but I love this audience. We have to go out and vote. We got to get young people out to vote.
The whole idea of sneakers has become so insanely commercialized that the industry and its expectations are completely warped. And on top of this, I mean, just try to picture people wearing the hypebeast shoes and clothes these days. I mean, you can't. Fashion has simply changed. I mean, dad shoes are back, neutral colors are back, People aren't going out in bright red Supreme fits anymore. However, in the end, it wasn't just changing fashion trends that killed sneaker culture. My fourth main reason comes down to simple economics, especially following a post-pandemic economy where everything is expensive. I mean, eggs are getting too damn pricey, so why would I pay a bunch of money for some fancy shoes? A longtime sneaker fan said on a forum, as a 13-year collector, I have to say yes, the sneaker culture sucks now. You can't even buy the kicks you want without going above and beyond and out of your way. I think it's officially time to throw in the towel. Because of resellers, most sneakerheads were priced out of the game, and all at a time for where many, money was already tight. The industry has done its best to stay relevant with younger generations, but with disposable income for many people seemingly drying up, it doesn't seem like it's working too well. Even though sneaker prices have come back down a little bit, retail is still pretty expensive. Nowadays, a lot of would-be sneaker buyers are leaning more towards experiences over material purchases. Plus, most people working regular jobs that have some money saved up also have side hustles, and they don't want to waste that money on sneakers. Real-world problems popped up left and right, which made the average household budget a lot more tight.
Do you feel like there are a lot less resale shops now?
A lot of shops have shut down.
Yeah.
That's only because of Nike. It's because of like the whole, economy. People don't have the same amount of money, right, to spend on sneakers as freely they did 5 years ago. Your bills go up, Easy Pass goes up, tolls go up, gas goes up. Your pay doesn't go up as much drastically as your bills go up. So people are just generally spending a little lesser than they used to.
No one has time or money to care anymore, and I think that's pretty apparent. I mean, wearing a fake pair of shoes used to be the worst thing ever, and now I doubt anyone would bat an eye if I wore a pair of Yeezy Reps. By the way, speaking of that, I've been looking for a good rep